Welcome to the Abundant Wellness Podcast. I'm Andrea, registered nurse, functional health practitioner, author, and mom navigating the very real trenches of parenting kids with sensitive, complex nervous systems. This podcast is for parents who are tired of being told to just try harder, who feel the grief of realizing you can't fix your child, but still refuse to believe that this is the end of your story. Here, we talk about what actually helps: nervous system informed parenting, functional health, the gut-brain connection, emotional resilience, and faith in the middle of the mess. See, you're raising a child who's not broken, but deeply wired. My hope is that every episode helps you to feel less alone, more anchored, and better equipped to support both yourself and your child. If you're ready for compassionate science, honest conversations, and hope that doesn't bypass reality, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Abundant Wellness Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the exhaustion that nobody talks about, what it actually costs to parent a child with a sensitive nervous system or a nervous system disability. And this is the type of exhaustion that does not show up on your to-do list. It's not reflected by your to-do list. So if I were to look down at my list today, I see my client appointments, I see my kids' different activities, but that list actually doesn't typically correlate to the level of exhaustion that you feel as a parent of a child with a nervous system disability or with special needs. And I want to talk to you about why. So this is not physical tiredness alone. There is a mismatch between what you're able to do and what you feel like you should be able to do because you have a child that has a nervous system that requires you to be on all of the time. And so this is why it's not just a physical tiredness alone. Parenting a child with a sensitive nervous system requires constant emotional availability. If you think about the level of intensity, the level of demand on you when you were raising a newborn and you had to be up every 3 hours to nurse or bottle feed or change a diaper or soothe their colic or soothe their distress. So many of us are raising children whose nervous systems never outgrew that level of demand. So there's this constant pull on your emotional availability. There's this constant need for real-time nervous system regulation that you don't really ever get a break from, and a vigilance in you that never fully shuts off. And when I say vigilance, hopefully you understand what I mean by that, but that is the having to be on, quote unquote, where you are vigilant to your surroundings. You're vigilant to something could always be going wrong at any given time. I want to say this to you, that if you're feeling tired, it's not because you're weak. You're tired because your nervous system is having to work so much harder than a parent of a neurotypical child. And so your level of fatigue may not even match what you see on your to-do list. So let's say you're having coffee with a friend that has a child that's fairly neurodevelopmentally normal, for lack of a better phrase. And they're, saying, oh my gosh, I'm so tired because my kid was up all night throwing up. And hopefully they're not meeting with you if that's the case. But you're like, yeah, I'm exhausted. And they say, oh, what have you been up to lately? And in your head, you're thinking, well, I had to deal with a meltdown for 5 hours. I couldn't get my kid to eat breakfast because I didn't cook at the right temperature. And the color looked weird and the texture was weird. And then everything was thrown off. And then it was a total absolute fight just getting them to school. And by the time I got them to school, I was sweaty and emotional and just on the verge of tears. And then by the time I came home, I had nothing left to give. And most of us don't share that part of the story, right? We're sharing that we feel tired, but maybe we don't share what's actually going on behind the scenes because we feel like people won't really understand. And we don't have the emotional capacity to deal with that kind of feeling judged or feeling misunderstood on top of everything else that we're dealing with. And so you're not dealing with a normal level of tired. You are dealing with an exhaustion that is bone deep. And so let's talk about what parenting a child with a sensitive nervous system actually costs you. And if you are feeling that urge to skip over this episode because you already know that it's costing you something and you already know that it's costing you too much, and you don't need somebody else telling you how bad this is for you, I want to encourage you to hang with me on this episode, because this isn't an episode just saying how bad parenting a child with special needs is. This is an episode where we're going to develop real tools, real systems to get out of that level of distress and anxiety and exhaustion. There is hope at the end of this, but we can't change how we do things and how we show up unless we really have take an in-depth assessment of how we're actually doing. Okay. So what is this actually costing us? Because it's costing us far more than we could even probably write down in a list. But I'm going to give you a list because this should help you to hopefully develop some internal resources to resource yourself emotionally. But it should also help you to advocate for yourself and what you need, because in order to get what we need, we have to name what we need. And in order to name what we need, we have to know what we need. Okay. So there's the cognitive cost, and that is the cost of always scanning. You're scanning your environment for changes in tone of voice, for the pause that's too long, the quiet that lasted for longer than it should. You're scanning for facial expressions that indicate whether or not we are headed into a 5-hour meltdown or 20 minutes of dysregulation. And then we're also on top of that, we're scanning our environment for how the other family members might respond to this type of distress or dysregulation that's coming from the child. Okay. Then we're also scanning for environmental triggers. So for example, if you have a child that really struggles with any sort of change in routine, then you have this routine set up to get them to school, right? You've got their socks laid out, you've got their shoes laid out for them so they don't have to think about it in the morning. You've got their routine down, really good. And then you get to school and something has changed. Maybe somebody cut in line before them and they really need to be first in line in order to feel regulated in the classroom, and somebody else got there first, right? Now, you're scanning for these environmental triggers and your anxiety is heightened and your threat response is online, right? It takes an extreme amount of energy to not only be in that state of heightened arousal, but then to have to come out of it also takes work. And this is work that other parents of neurotypical children don't have to do. You're constantly anticipating meltdowns or dysregulation before they happen. And not only that, you are assessing the environment, who you're around, and can they handle this meltdown that my child might have? Can my husband, my partner, the siblings, can they handle this? Can grandparents? So you're constantly in this level of threat that you weren't meant to be in. Our bodies were not meant to be in that level of stress long term. Then there's the emotional cost. Okay. So I want you to just, as I'm talking, I'm sharing from lived experience. These are things I've actually experienced. I feel it acutely in my body when I'm talking about it. But I want you to just pay attention to the sensations in your body while I'm talking. Where do you feel that? Does it feel like tightness? Does it feel like your heart's racing? Does it feel like heat? Does it feel like cold? Does it feel like tension? Does it feel like pain? All of those signals are useful and beneficial if we pay attention to them. Because again, there's going to be energy required to come out of that space. But not only are you in that space physically, you're also in this emotional space that does have an emotional cost. And that is holding your child's big emotions while suppressing your own. I think so often, our generation, at least those of us born in the mid 80s, early 80s or to early 90s, our parents, I feel like they probably did the best that they could, but they certainly did not have the emotional regulation tools that we have today, right? And so many of us have our own triggers that we're working through, our own unmet needs, right? Our own childhood stuff. And we're holding our child's big emotions while not being able to process our own. So finding a space where we're seen, validated, understood, heard, and then can co-regulate with other people is a very important part of our own healing process and then coming out of crisis mode. The emotional cost is also constantly absorbing other people's dysregulation and having to then move on from it, especially if you have other kids. We're not typically able to we don't always have the luxury of being able to move from one moment of distress with our child that's not neurotypical to then, let's say, in my case, I had a child that was 8 and a child that was 4 at the time. And so there were normal 4-year-old behaviors and meltdowns, and then there were abnormal 8-year-old meltdowns and behaviors. And I had to very quickly move from abnormal to normal. And I felt like my capacity was just being stretched well beyond what I actually had available to me internally. So there's that constantly absorbing dysregulation that in and of itself is dysregulating. Parenting a child with ADHD, autism, PDA, anxiety, or ODD, and you are exhausted trying to figure out what's actually going on, I want you to hear this. Many of the kids I work with also struggle with symptoms like constipation, diarrhea, bloating, skin issues, or brain fog. And while it can feel like the behavioral and digestive pieces are separate, they're not. They are deeply connected. And that's why the Happy Tummies, Happy Kids program helps to resolve this problem. It is a 4-month root cause approach program that looks at your child's whole system through a functional lens, not to change who they are, but to improve their function and reduce suffering regardless of the diagnosis. If you're wondering whether this kind of support is right for your child, the next step is to book a Strong Start discovery call. It's a conversation with me to understand your child's unique needs and see if this program is a good fit for them. You can schedule a Strong Start discovery call using the link in the show notes. You don't have to figure this out alone, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Then there's staying calm and the energy that it takes to actually stay calm when you're internally flooded, or whether that's being flooded with flashbacks or emotional flashbacks, or just feeling internally flooded with emotions that are, trying to find their way through the nervous system to become regulated. And then, there is what happens physiologically when you live in that low grade chronic fight or flight, or I wouldn't even say low grade, I would say like medium to high grade fight or flight. And that is elevated cortisol. We know that that disrupts the sleep signaling. It disrupts insulin signaling, especially for women. So that's where we tend to notice weight gain issues, like as if we needed more on our plate to deal with, right? Never fully being able to come down from your stressors, and there are multiple studies, and any parent could be like, this is a no-brainer. We don't even need to do a study on this. But there are so many studies out there that show that parents of children with neurodivergence or chronic conditions not only report higher stress, their bodies show measurable changes to that stress physiology, mainly those altered cortisol patterns. And when that happens, we have dysregulated sleep patterns, so sleep disruption, anxiety, cardiometabolic strain, so actual physical changes to like our cardiovascular system, which then leads to blood sugar dysregulation, weight issues, and a whole host of other inflammatory and immune dysregulating processes. I don't say this to scare you. I say this because when we are raising a child with, I'll just call it a nervous system disability, whether that's anxiety, autism, ODD, PDA, whatever it is, we have got to, it's not an option not to. We have got to parent differently, not only our children, but we actually have to parent ourselves and take care of ourselves differently so that this doesn't take us under, because it absolutely will. And so that's part of why I'm here. That's part of why I'm sharing not only our story, but the stories of others, because it matters. And I truly believe that there is a way out of the toxic cycles that we get in when we're raising children that have such a high demand on us all the time. You and your child, this is the key thing I wanted you to take away from this just conversation that we're having. You and your child are sharing a nervous system, and that has a price, which means that we have to begin to build in buffers that help us to come out of those cycles of stress, regulate, and develop more internal resources. That's actually part of what's not part of what's included. A huge chunk of what I talk about in the Thriving Together community is nervous system regulation, practical steps, practical videos, practical trainings that you can use in real time to shift you out of those states and get your confidence back as a parent. And not just your confidence, but get your nervous system back. That's really what that's all for. And if we want our children to have a healthy nervous system, we have to do that work in ourselves as well to make sure that we can handle the load that's being placed on us and access appropriate resources. I think this is an important place to talk about why this type of exhaustion is so misunderstood. And part of it has to do with that mismatch that I talked about at the beginning of the episode, where you're like, I couldn't even list out, like, if I write out what I did today, I unloaded the dishwasher, I made breakfast, I took my oldest to school, and those three things don't really equal the level of tired that I feel. But that's because in between each of these things, you dealt with a 20-minute meltdown or a 2-hour meltdown, right? Or 35 minutes of rage and 27 minutes of throwing a fit about the texture of the food, right? Those are the invisible burdens that we carry. And it's also part of the reason why we feel so isolated and judged. And on top of that, we have this traditional parenting advice that assumes that my child being compliant and easy means success, and that consistency alone solves these behavioral problems, when that is 1,000,000% not true. Consistency helps, but it doesn't build a scaffolding in their nervous system that they don't have. Like, they're actually missing necessary, essential functions. It's like being locked out of a room and knowing that inside of that room, you could have all of the executive planning and the nervous system regulation and the emotional calm to be able to do those things, but you're locked outside of that room. That's what these kids feel like when they explain why they can't do certain things. And so consistency as a parent helps them to feel like they're in a predictable and safe environment. And it does provide a certain level of safety for them because they know what they can predict in a very unpredictable world, but it not in the sense of like, just be consistent in your discipline and they'll get it. That's not how this works for most of our kids. The systems outside of our home and even inside of our home were not built for sensitive kids. They just were not. Schools, churches, extended family, gatherings, you name it, generally speaking, are not built for kids with dysregulated nervous systems and nervous system disabilities. And so we are constantly, as parents, bumping up against these obstacles in our way to trying to help our children be successful. And by successful, I just mean help them to navigate a world, an internal world that's very scary and where their threat response is very real. And that leads to the shame spiral, which is all of these other parents seem fine. They're able to handle all of these things. I said this to my husband so many times, and thank God for his logic and his reasoning, because I would say, like, I just don't understand. Like, everyone else around me seems like they're doing so well, and I feel like I'm just sinking and failing every single day. And that is because, and he would just say to me, he's like, Andrea, they don't have the kid that you have. They simply do not. And so, and it's not that my kid is bad. It's that their nervous system requires something different of me. And therefore, the metrics that I use to measure my success have to be different. And so the truth really is that you're not failing at parenting. You're parenting in a system that does not actually understand these type of nervous systems that are sensitive. And so we have to build our own systems, right? We have to reframe a lot of what's happening in our world. One of the biggest and most easily fixed issues that I see in parents raising neurodivergent children or parents of children with a complex medical diagnosis is actually mineral deficiencies and low electrolytes. When we are under chronic stress, as raising these children is chronically stressful, we run through our electrolytes and our minerals very, very quickly, which then puts a lot of stress on pretty much every organ system in the body. So one of the things that I teach a lot of the parents that I work with is a very quick action step, which is to just grab a scoop of electrolytes and add it to your water 1 to 2 times a day. It's one of the easiest ways that you can nourish your body so that you don't end up in a state of depletion. When we are mineral balanced, when our electrolytes are balanced, we sleep better, we respond to stress better, we bounce back a lot quicker from events that are really stressful. So one of the electrolytes that I use is Paleo Valley. They're super duper clean, no food coloring, no yucky ingredients. ingredients, super affordable. I have a 15% off link for you in the show notes. One thing that you can do to care for yourself today is to grab some electrolytes, add it to your water, and remind yourself that you're worth nourishing too. And I just want to acknowledge something that often happens in this space, because when you're bumping up against all of these, not only internal obstacles, right? The challenge that you face on a daily basis to raise a child that's different, the exhaustion that you feel, the judgments that sometimes come, spoken or unspoken, from the outside, right? Underneath all of that is this compounded grief that nobody names. And it took me forever. It took me years and years to figure out that that's what I was actually feeling, was a layer of grief underneath all of that. And we have to create some room to go there, because it's like these micro moments of grief. You're living in your world, right? And you've come to accept certain things, and you've accepted maybe your child's diagnosis or their disability or how that impacts the home. And you're just living in that on a daily basis. And then you bump up against this outside world systems that tell you that you're doing it wrong, that there's something wrong with your child or your parenting, or that you just haven't tried enough to fix them. And all of a sudden you're catapulted right back into the grief that's always been there, but just isn't tapped into on a daily basis because we're just going about our day, right? And that grief is really about the parenting, not getting the parenting experience that you expected, not being able to have ease, spontaneity, or simplicity. There were so many years where every aspect of our day had to be planned out like to a T, no changes. And I, as a little bit of neurospicy myself, and a little bit of ADHD sprinkled in there, that felt very restrictive and confining to me. And so there was loss there. There's the loss of like watching everybody else around you sign your kid up for sports when you're enrolling them in another therapy intensive, or having to spend all of your vacation money on more testing and more treatments. Like, there is real grief in that. And so we have to recognize that sometimes those moments come like little punches, right? And they just kind of knock the wind out of you when you're not expecting them. And then there's also the grief of not ever being able to turn it off. And I just want to normalize that grief, and that deep love that you have for your child can coexist. It doesn't mean that you resent your child. Sometimes it just means you resent the journey, and that the journey has changed you in ways that you aren't sure you're in agreement with. And if that's you, I do want to invite you to join the Thriving Together community. We have a lot of resources in there on grief, navigating grief, processing grief, navigating that with hope, finding God in the midst of that, if that's something that you're looking for. So I do want to invite you. The link is in the show notes if you're wanting to join us there. And there's a 7-day free access, so you can kind of scope things out and decide if you want to stay. The fact is that you can deeply, deeply adore your child and still mourn how hard this is for you. Okay. So I wanted to briefly talk about the grief aspect of this. I want to circle back to why rest alone is not enough, and why so many of us get stuck in this cycle of doom scrolling, right? Like, we're trying to regulate our system. And so really what we're trying to do is check out from all of the overstimulation. I'm not shaming you for that. I think that sometimes it has its place. If it is a tool that regulates you and brings you back into some sort of nervous system balance, I think you can use it as that. If you're doing that and you don't feel a sense of recovery, that's why we have to start looking at what other ways can we support ourselves. So why rest alone is not enough. You can sleep all night long and still feel depleted. You can eat, all the best foods and still feel depleted, because the nervous system is still not in a place where it feels safe enough to rest. And this is where we actually have to send physical cues and emotional cues of safety to our body to get into a state of rest. And that true restoration requires emotional regulation, It requires internal and external support. It requires being witnessed in your process. And that's where, sometimes sharing with a trusted friend, or if that feels too vulnerable to you, sharing with a counselor or a coach what you're going through, what you're experiencing, being witnessed, being validated, that restores our sense of safety. And this exhaustion does not mean that you need to just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You need more grit. It actually means that you need more safety, more comfort, more love, more regulation. Okay. And we talk all about how to do that in the Thriving Together community. And I'll be talking about that more in other episodes as well. So what actually helps without adding more to your plate? Okay. Because we have to be realistic. Like I've done a couple reels on this where it's like, ain't nobody got time for all the things that we see like the wellness coaches doing. And I'm not saying those things are bad, like walking and lifting weights and reading and journaling and praying and all of those things. But we have to actually start in a little bit of a different place, I think, as a parent raising a child with a complex medical illness or a nervous system disability. So what actually helps? Naming the load out loud. And you can actually do this throughout your day. This is called narrating your experience. And you can actually be your own witness before you invite other people in to be a witness and validate your process. And that can look something like putting your hand on your heart and just saying, you know what, that tantrum this morning, that really took it out of me. It really triggered me. I felt really dysregulated. I felt like a bad mom. I felt like I was failing my child. Name it out loud, because you're actually getting it out of your nervous system when you do that. And putting some sort of physical pressure on your body, gentle, firm, however that needs to be, a containment hug where you're squeezing yourself, letting somebody else hug you while naming that out loud can be really, really helpful. It's free. It takes no time. Okay. Shifting the goal from obedience to regulation. This gets easier with time, but it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of practice, because the goal is not for my child to behave. It cannot be that I change their behavior. It cannot be that I fix their diagnosis. None of those things can be my goals. My only goal can be to stay regulated and to stay present in my body with them as much as I am able, and growing that capacity over time. Letting go of unrealistic expectations. Some of us have to spend some time writing this out. This can be unrealistic expectations of yourself. It can be unrealistic expectations of your child. And usually it's both. We got to spend some time there looking at what our expectations are. Is it realistic for me to expect that from my child where they're at in their developmental and healing process? And then, of course, being in spaces where you don't have to justify or explain yourself, where you can share your story and people are just like, yeah, I get it. That's a really important thing to do, because we all need people that really understand us. Okay. So support is not a luxury. It is a luxury. But it's not just a luxury. It's a biologic need. And we have to stop treating it like it's the last resort. And we need to actually start treating it like it is the first, primary, most important thing for me to do. So I want to encourage you, and I want to end with some reassurance and hope that nothing is wrong with you for this being hard. The struggles that your child is walking through is not necessarily a reflection of you or your parenting. This is hard because it is hard. This feels hard because it is hard. Okay. So you're not exhausted because you're doing it wrong. You're exhausted because you're doing something incredibly demanding, and often without the support that you feel like you need to do this well. And so if that's you, I want to offer you some compassion. I want you to take some time to be compassionate towards yourself. I want to again remind you that the Thriving Together community is open. So this is a place where this exhaustion is understood, where you do not have to perform or explain. You just get to show up, take what you need, whether that's the community support, the live coaching, the quick, impactful videos. All of this is available to you in there. And, if this episode blessed and encouraged you, I hope that you're able to share with a friend. Thanks for hanging around, and stay tuned for another episode of the Abundant Wellness Podcast. Have a great day.